we go
All
ahead
right.
and get
Well,
this going?
I'm sure people will still keep floating in, but we've got a pretty healthy attendance in here at the moment. So we will go ahead and get things kicked off. Welcome everybody to this live webinar. We're very excited to do this. It's been a little while since we last did a webinar here at Starboard. Life gets in the way sometimes, and especially the last couple years of global complications. Of course, things have gotten a little out of hand. So we're very excited to be back. We hope that this will be the start of a more regular presentation series. Joining us today as speakers from Starboard, I'm sure you may know them, but if you don't already, we have Amy Tatum, who is our EVP and Technical Director here at Starboard. Amy, do you want to say hello?
Hello.
Hello. And then we also have Tom Coulombe, who is a Maximo technical consultant here at Starboard. He's been with the company for quite a few years and has 17 plus years of experience with Maximo and EAM industry. And the two of them are going to tackle the challenge of demystifying the Maximo Integration Framework, the MIF. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Amy and we can get this thing started.
All right. Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. As Sam said, we're going to talk a little bit about the MIF, the Maximo Integration Framework, which is something Tom and I have been working with for many, many years, all the way back to the days that it was actually known as the MIA and not the MIF. So there's been some transitions with that, as there have been with everything Maximo since the early versions. So just a little bit about Starboard, for those of you that may not be as familiar with us. I recognize a lot of names I see in the chat, so welcome to all of our friends and the new folks. But we're a gold accredited IBM business partner. We've been around for about 16 years now and pretty much do all things Maximo. So we're a Maximo focused consultancy. That's all we do, but we do a lot of integrations, mobile systems, anything that has to do with Maximo implementation, upgrade, training, testing. You name it. If you can spell it with Maximo, then we can make it happen for you. So thanks again for joining us, and hopefully you'll get some good information out of this webinar. And if you have any follow-up questions that we're not able to get to during the course of the time, then we can certainly reach back out on those. But the chat is open, so do post your comments there, and we will try to answer those either during the session if we have time or at the end as well.
I will also add one quick note, which we are recording this webinar. Teams probably let you know that when you first came in, but just to let you know, you are being recorded. And at the end of this webinar, we will be taking that recording and uploading it so that people can have access to it following this webinar in case you have to leave or you just weren't able to attend in the first place.
All right. Yeah, thanks. So Sam's already introduced Tom and I. As he said, I'm the EVP and Technical Director at Starboard. I've been working with Maximo for over 20 years now. I got my start in engineering with a utility company and then went over and started doing some consulting on asset management systems and thus began my Maximo career. I've been named an IBM champion 2 years in a row now, so very honored with that distinction. And that's a program that IBM has that just recognizes people who contribute a lot to the IBM software communities, ours being Maximo, and through these webinars and our support of other industry events and training sessions and things like that. Joining me is Tom, who's on our technical team. He leads a lot of our implementations and does a lot of integration work, data loading, reporting, etc. So Tom, you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. As Amy said, I've been working with Maximo for 17 years. I've done a lot of GIS spatial integrations lately, but I've also done fleet fuel systems, financial applications. What's the other one? SCADA data.
Yeah.
You name it. Like we've integrated to it. We've imported data from it. And like with that, we do the underlying features. For reporting and data loading. Are also kind of those integration objects. So lots of experience and lots of fun interfaces.
Ironically, I was actually on the client site this morning talking about an interface to building automation systems. So you've got more work coming your way here shortly.
All right.
All right, so let's jump right in. So today we're going to talk about the MIF. At its core, it supports 1- and 2-way communications via REST APIs, web services. There's some adapters. You can do file-based interfaces. All of those are going to roll through a channel or service. The underlying object structures are all there that gets you access to all of the Maximo data elements, the tables and columns that you're used to seeing. And of course, underlying all that is the WebSphere Liberty platform. So it looks pretty simple. I won't spend a lot of time on this overview because we're going to dive right in and talk about how you build interfaces and kind of what they look like. So from there, the core integration components, when we put together an interface, really the 3 primary things we're looking at, and this is just kind of the surface, is the object structures, which define our data layer that determines what are the objects and attributes we're integrating. The services and channels, which define what we're sending and receiving and applies any processing rules that we may have, as well as the external systems, which identifies the communication protocols and the services channels and queues that we would be using. So when you look at that, it's simple. 1, 2, 3, we're done. Everything comes together really well, and it works perfect every time on the first time out, right?
Of course. That's why we go right to prod.
Yes, exactly. So there's obviously a lot of other pieces of that, but that is kind of the basics of it. There's a lot of other applications that come into play there that we'll talk more about, but those are the 3 main things. So I guess, as we look at that, Tom, what are your thoughts on this, and should we just dive right into the first piece there with the object structures?
Yeah, we can, those are the main 3 components. If we were using the service channel or the REST API, you might be able to, or I'm sorry, if you're using the REST API or a web service, you might be able to skip the service channel. But I think these are the core pieces, and of course, there's the outliers, JSON mapping, API keys, and stuff like that that we can go into a little bit later.
Okay. All right. So starting with the object structures. These are the initial building blocks of any integration. This is where we define the tables and attributes that would be involved in the integration. The object structures themselves are used for a lot of other things. So as you go into that application and look at the list view, you'll see things that are tied to the migration manager, reporting, integrations. A lot of mobile tools use these as well. So these are really kind of the key foundational step, I think, in building any integration. So, what are some of the key things that you would point out to somebody who's maybe creating an object structure?
Well, I think, one of the things that you got to think about here is one of our old colleagues used to call this like a select statement, so it's the select and the from. So we're going to choose the fields, and we're going to use the include, exclude boxes to figure out which attributes we want to update, which attributes we want to export, whatever we want to include in that object. And we also have the opportunity to use persistent attributes or non-persistent attributes. So your persistent ones are the ones that actually exist in the database. And then your non-persistent ones are either a formula or generated at runtime. So your classification path or, for integration objects, they include the long description so that you don't have to include the long description table and make that relationship and everything on every one. So those are really kind of cool features that you're able to do relatively quickly, but you can choose which ones to include or exclude. And then, you also choose the objects that you want to do. So if you're doing an asset object or an asset data load, you might want to include asset specs. You might want to include spare parts spare parts or asset meters or stuff like that, so you can pick and choose which ones you want to include. And, if you are copying like the MX asset object, you have the option to get rid of the ones that you're not going to use if they're not required. Obviously, every system can, require that you have these attributes filled out even on some of the subtables. So just, understand that as you're going into it. But
I think on the non-persistence, some of the other stuff that falls under there is things that you would do via actions. So like if you've got an existing asset that's at a location, you don't want to just data load and overwrite that location. So by using one of the non-persistent new location fields, it'll actually create that as a move transaction.
right.
Through
True.
that. Same thing
And your
with
status
status and
changes.
status changes in memo fields.
Yeah, it's important to understand how that all works because it all goes through the Maximo MBOs, and so it's still very much controlled, so you don't end up with random data in your system.
So I remember back in the days, you creating an object structure on, say, work order, and you got 200 fields on that table, but you really only want 10 of them. That left you with 190 boxes to uncheck because by default, everything was included. So nowadays, we've got an option to switch that around, right? We can default with exclude.
Yeah, so they added somewhere in 7.6. I'm not sure which version anymore. They all kind of blur together a little bit. But they added an option, and you have to do it when you're setting up the object. So your existing objects you can't do this to, but when you're setting up the initial object, you can set it so that you're going to go to exclude option or exclude attribute mode for each for each object in your integration object. So instead of saying I'm going to have the asset table with all its attributes, it's going to give you can click that button and it will give you the asset object, and it'll only select the required fields. So asset num, site ID, those ones are the only ones that are going to be checked from start. So that it's a huge change to the way that works. And I know, for some cases, so for data loading, I like to use, I don't like to exclude a lot of attributes. I like to kind of leave it open because clients like to make changes as they see it, and data load kind of changes in that respect. But for interfaces, it really should be, consolidated down to just the attributes that you're using.
I think that point that you have to go to exclude mode before, as at the very beginning, you can't do it later, is a really important one, because I think several times we've created the objects and then realized like, oh shoot, that's right, I meant to toggle that.
Well, I mean, the good thing is that when you're going to create it and then you go to your exclude, you're like, oh, okay, we're not too far into the process, so we can go back and correct that mistake, delete the objects and re-add them, and then a little bit, as long as you catch it before you start getting into actually loading the data and stuff like that, creating your interface tables, and
So one of the toggles we have here on the screen for the object structures is to use the flat structure. Doing that allows us to do things that might be based on flat files, which of course a lot of the data loads are, as well as interface tables, things like that. What are some of the key things that you need to point out related to if we're doing something with multiple objects, but we're trying to do it in a flat?
So a flat file structure is going to require that there's no attributes with the same name. So you take asset and asset spec. Asset has asset number and asset spec has assets number, right? So that's going to create what they call an alias conflict. And you're going to need to make sure that you rename one of those attributes so that it's unique. What I like to do, and I do this, I don't just do it for the ones that are in conflict. I kind of do it by object. So if I'm loading assets and asset specs, I like to leave the asset alone. So, right? And then I put all my aliases on the asset spec, but I don't just do asset number. I do it for the entire row. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to, when I am building my template, or I'm building or I'm looking at the interface table, I know what I'm, like I know that I set this prefix to AS for asset spec. and that all these attributes that start with AS are now part of that asset spec object, and that way I can make sure to keep those all together, or and I know where the problem child may or may not be. So it's just one of those things I like to do to keep it consolidated.
Good standards to have. So, so another question for you, auto numbering. I know we run into that a lot if we're bringing in data from GIS, from another asset system, from a data load, and we want to auto number that. There's some specific things you need to do to set that up, right? Before Maximo will know to give that new record the next unique key.
So, the first thing is you got to set that up in database configuration. So you have to set it up so that you have an auto key and it knows what it's going to be. And then, when you go into Maximo, the way to test that is you go into Maximo and you create a new asset, and it's going to say asset 11000, whatever, and it's going to tell you that's the asset number. So when you're loading the data into Maximo, or using an interface or a data load, then you can leave that attribute blank and Maximo will know to create that new record. And if you are updating the record, you just include that record and Maximo will go out and find it, and it'll update the appropriate asset number. It's also important.
Go ahead. Sorry. Finish your thought.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think I lost my thought now. That you have to be using the appropriate processing. So we're adding records, so we're going to use an add or an add change. If we're just doing a change, we would use change. So you can't add, you have to include the asset number if you're doing an add. If you're not doing an add, if you're doing a change, you can't.
Other way around, I think, right?
If you're doing a change, you have to include the asset number. If you're not doing,
if you're doing
an add, you can't. You don't have to include the asset number.
Right.
All right. And you were going to ask me a question.
I was going to ask you about alternate keys. So along those lines, if I'm doing a change, but maybe my external system, like the BAS I was talking about with some clients this morning, they don't have the Maximo asset number in that. They use another ID value. So when you're looking at alternate keys to update records, there's some nuances involved with that. And sometimes they don't always work because of the database requirements around an alternate key.
Yeah, so you can do it that way. So what you do is you would set up an index, but it has to be something that Maximo is keeping track of. So one of the ones we did was based on serial number. So I think there were meters, and the data coming in didn't necessarily have the Maximo asset number, but it had the serial number. So we created an index for that specific asset type, that specific classification, and that specific site. And then that asset, it kind of created this unique key that we would only look and find one record, and we would update that one record with using those identifiers instead of the traditional Maximo asset and site. And then you would set up that index in database configuration, and then in your integration object, it's not shown on this screen, but if you opened up the drop down, you would be able to see the an alternate index, and that will change kind of that whole what's required and what Maximo can look up by that index too. So if you actually put one of those in, you can actually go into your exclude and include, and it'll actually tell you that, hey, this asset num and site ID is not necessarily required anymore.
Yeah. Cool. All right.
But it's a very cool feature to have, and we've used it a number of times.
Yeah, we've used it quite a bit. So let's go ahead and move on to step number 2, which is going to be our services and channels. So the easy part of this, services are inbound, channels are outbound. We can set them up as synchronous or asynchronous, which basically means whether or not there's a queue involved or if it's an immediate message and response. What else do we want to say about these?
Well, this is where we set up our interface tables again. This is just where we name it. So this is going to be a unique identifier. I like to keep, but it's going to actually become a database object within database configuration too. So that's important to note. So it's got to be unique to the tables in Maximo. So you can't just create an interface called asset. That won't work. So I like to include maybe iFace or IF or something in there, something to let me know that it's an interface table. Or you can even use, if you're interfacing to like SAP, SAP asset iFace or something like that. And that will kind of give it a unique table structure or table name. We'll get into the creation of those objects a little later in the external systems. Foreshadowing. And then, like we can also set up an XSL map. If you're, using XML to go to another system, you can configure something to kind of adjust the XML that you're sending to that system kind of after the Java exit is run. Message tracking is set up, and it's such an important piece. So in their services and channels, this is where you get to define which channels are actually, logging and message tracking. So message tracking, you I use it kind of as a troubleshooting mechanism. Make sure that Maximo is getting a message, and if you choose to include the message tracking, the message, then you can see the actual message that's being sent, and kind of try and determine maybe why it might not be doing exactly what you want it to do. But there's a lot of different kind of options within message tracking to do that. But there's also what was I going to say? Oh, the message identifiers. So one of the things I just kind of figured out recently. So typically you get XML messages, but when dealing with spatial and stuff like that, you get a lot of JSON messages. So when you're dealing with XML messages, you want to use the XPath format to kind of create those messages. But if you're using JSON messages, if you're receiving a JSON message, you want to use the JSON path method to kind of identify those identifiers so that you can store the message. And basically that'll put in rather than saying an error has occurred, you can actually say an error occurred on this external reference ID, because it may or may not have an asset or a location in Maximo for you to know which one messed up, right? So it's kind of an easier way to identify it. So, but yeah, definitely if you're using a JSON message, then definitely switch to JSON math. Otherwise, if you try and use XPath, it gets an error and becomes this big thing.
Yeah, those message IDs are super helpful in troubleshooting and being able to go back and look at the message tracking and search by, work order number, external reference ID, whatever it might be, because you've able to parse out some of that data and put it in a more usable format within the message tracking application.
Yeah. So, you can also see that there's a spice for the user exit class, which is kind of a Java class that you would create or to filter or manipulate the data outside of the processing class, right? But we're using those less and less and kind of moving more towards the automation scripts, which we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah, I don't have a graphic of it, but there's a defined order, if you can find it in the IBM documentation, of, once a message comes in, it's transformed with an XSLT to whatever format. It's going to hit the object structure and any rules that might be in place through your processing rules, which you would set up here in the services or channels. I think then it hits the processing class and the user exit class. But there's a specific order that those things happen in. But like Tom said, the fact that we can do almost all of that through automation scripts now has really made the need for the processing classes to go way down. There's some stuff that you want to do with processing rules here that you can't, and you've got to pull in a script. But the processing rules themselves can be used a lot to set values and replace fields and that kind of stuff. Another little gotcha I know I've run into a couple of times on the published channels themselves is we'll start testing an interface and kind of, make a status change on a work order and expect it to send out, and it doesn't. And you're, well, it's enabled on the external system and everything looks good. And then you come back to the published channel and realize that the event listener was disabled. So whenever you're creating a new one on the channel, you got to make sure you enable that event listener, or it's just going to ignore whatever is happening on the Maximo side that should have been sending out messaging to your external systems.
Yeah. I did want to mention too, it looks like we have gotten a couple of questions in the chat. Do we want to try to tackle those as we go through the webinar or save them till the end?
I'm going to save some of them till the end. But thanks, Sam, for pointing that out.
No problem.
So, all right, so let's move on to step number 3 then, which is our external systems. So this is where we kind of pulled it all together. We've got the published channels or enterprise services, things that we've set up as far as the messaging that would be coming in and out. Here we're going to identify what queue we're going to use. Some of the endpoint information we get tied in here. The endpoints themselves will be set up in another application. But this is kind of where we bowl it all together. So what else are we going to do here in this application, Tom?
Well, as you can see, you've got there right there on the screen, you've got whether or not it's enabled. So you can actually enable it at the enterprise service level or at the external system level. Or I guess the published channel too. So you can choose which pieces are active, and then you can also choose whether or not you're going to use the continuous queue or the sequential queue. So the difference being that you're going to want to use the sequential queue if the data in the related information, if the data is going to be dependent on another record getting processed ahead of it, you're going to want to use the sequential queue. So maybe like a location hierarchy. You can't put a parent in for a location that doesn't already exist. So the parent has to exist first. So you would want to use a sequential queue in hierarchy situations or something like that.
The other place we see that a lot is in purchasing interfaces. So if you're interfacing to an external financials application, you want to make sure that your PO is received and processed before your receipt is, and things like that. So the sequential queue can be really important when you need to mandate an order of processing and not let things get out of order.
You can, definitely don't want to get that out of order. So you can choose the queue only on the enterprise service. The published channels are all going to go through the sequential out. Sometimes it's helpful to add another sequential out, and you can choose which interface, or you can add as many queues as you want and choose which interfaces use which queue, and that will help, so that your asset integration doesn't interfere with your financial integration or something like that. So if you're using a lot of sequential queues.
Found that very important, especially if you've got one interface that might be a little problematic at times, or the external system isn't reliable. By splitting those up and having each interface on a different outbound queue, it means that that one error isn't going to block a whole bunch of other stuff from successfully sending. So that's a good point. I'd kind of forgotten that we do that quite a bit.
The other thing too is, like, any of these enterprise services can be used in any external system. But when you're building an interface, I like to keep them separate. I don't like to reuse my objects or my enterprise services in other interfaces, and I'll duplicate it and I mean, we build these things to be long-term, and long-term, you never know how the other systems are going to change. You never know how their interaction might change with Maximo. So you don't want to use the same enterprise service or the same object over and over within your integrations, and then, well, this one integration is going to change how the way that works, and you got to add an object, you got to do that.
Right.
So now you got to go back and test all those different other integrations where you're making this change to the object. So it's much easier to kind of keep it simple, and this enterprise service which works with this external system and this object, and it's very easy to duplicate any of those things. So you just want to, I don't know, don't overcomplicate it.
Yeah, that did remind me though, back on the object structures, I don't know if we mentioned this or not, but if you do a database configuration and add a new field, then usually by default, that's going to be included on the object. So if you've got that object used in multiple interfaces, you got to remember to go and take that, exclude that field back out if it's going to cause problems with your external system, or make an iFace table no longer match
Yeah,
the
you'll
Maximo
get those
tables.
SQL queries,
Yeah.
something or another is logged, SQL query errors are logged or something like that. And that's a telltale sign that you need to go back and rebuild your interface table. Which brings me to the foreshadowing I did here, and that's we can create the interface tables from external systems. And what's great about this is that it actually, it creates the table in the database. It creates the database object in database configuration in Maximo, and we don't need to do a database configuration.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. So sometimes the database configuration can be simple and sometimes it can be complex, but this allows us to create it without doing anything kind of structurally to Maximo itself.
Yeah.
The other important one is to add modify queues. So this is kind of where you would add the queues that I was talking about earlier if you wanted to have more than one sequential outbound or sequential inbound. And then you would also be able to get an idea of the records in the queue. So if you're wondering why an interface isn't running and then you do a queue count, you can see that there's 1,000 records that are ahead of the records that you were trying to load. So it might still be working through those. So
Yep.
it's a great place to do that.
Great. So that's kind of the basics of setting up an interface, which makes it sound pretty easy. But let's talk about what happens when the basics just don't get the job done. So one of the things that you've got, because the interfaces, the MIF is going to go through all of the Maximo object structures, essentially all the configuration tools that you have available to you if a user was keying in data on the front end can be available to you if the data is coming in through an interface. So things like workflows and escalations can be managed in that way. All your configuration tools, and one we're going to talk a lot about probably is the automation scripting, because that was a real game changer in the integration capabilities, as well as security and administration. So managing, what can be updated through an interface, what the user information is, things like that. So let's talk a little bit about, I kind of tried to show that here, and that we've got the same diagram from before, which is sort of the overview of the MIF, but then I've taken portions of another diagram that typically shows all the Maximo applications with the configuration framework underneath it, and taken a couple of those configuration bars and overlaid them here to kind of show that you've still got that capability even for data that's coming in via an interface or going out via an interface. Those config tools still apply. So what would you say? I mean, let's talk a little bit maybe about the automation scripting, because I know we use that a lot, and you just mentioned that we don't need as many processing classes now because of that. And there's some things that we've tried to do in the processing rules that you set up just right there on the published channels or enterprise services that you can't do. So what are some of the areas the automation scripting on the integrations have come in very handy?
Well, we've kind of filled the gaps in to, we got rid of there's some gaps between what you can do with processing rules and, creating a Java class is kind of, painstaking.
Well, yeah, and you've got rebuilds and redeploys and all that kind of stuff that go along there.
So by being able doing it in an automation script, it's a time saver from the development standpoint, which is amazing. And we had a fuel interface where we had the asset number, but not the site ID. And it could be one of 7 or 8 different site IDs for that particular client. So what we were able to do is take the asset, and we knew that it had to be a vehicle. So we were able to kind of create an automation script that would be able to look up that asset and then return the site for that asset and put that into the data and then continue the processing of that record, which is, we've done that one. I can't tell you how many times we've done that one, or similar situations where we've used that. I know, like, there's the JSON mapping we talk about with spatial, and a lot of that's fine and it works good, but when you get to it, it's passing values for domains, and when you're building a description, you don't want to use the values for the domains. You want to you want to get the domain values, so the kind of the description of that value, and put that into the description so that it actually means something to the users. So we did some lookups around that to kind of, so you get value 1, and then you can say this is a centrifugal pump type or something like that, so that you can take that value and put it into the description.
And the automation scripts, when you create them, there's no launch points on them, right? And they've got very specific naming conventions that tell you if they're object structure, the OSN, publish, different things like that. And we can't mess with those names because the predefined hooks are in the system, right?
No, you'll have, if you're doing kind of a lot, so like that's something we kind of, you'll have to find other ways to kind of conditionally process records. So with the GIS one, it was done by feature class. If the feature class is this, then the description are these 4 fields from our data, and do the lookups and recompile it. If it's something else, then it's these 5 fields, or sometimes it can be 3 fields, sometimes it can be 10 fields, but it can be the same with any other integration. So they're all going to use that kind of same. So you got to kind of think about how the object that you're creating, and so if it's an asset interface, how are you going to dissect which assets get this update for that particular integration? So you can't build one for an automation script for each asset type. You would have to just kind of build one for the integration, and then in the automation script kind of determine which one is, or kind of that condition of.
There's basically one per service or one per object structure. So if you're using that service to bring in multiple classes of asset or multiple types of work orders, then there's conditional logic within the script to let Maximo know how to respond to that. So yeah, definitely a great add though, and something that we didn't have available to us just a few years ago that's really made a big difference and made integrations more efficient and more maintainable. Beyond the regular configuration tools that you would think of with your DB config and the scripts and escalations and things, there's a few others that are a little bit more hidden. One of them I know we've used quite a bit are the collaboration switches. So those are stored in an MX collab table, and they basically define ownership of records, mostly financial, to identify if Maximo is the system of record for purchase requisitions, purchase orders, receiving inventory, things like that. And those can be used. They're used a lot by the SAP and Oracle adapter interface tools that are add-on solutions you can get from IBM, but you can use them outside of that as well to determine like if an inbound receipt would automatically update the balance and cost information of Maximo. So within the integration user guides, there's a whole lot of information about those collaboration switches, but knowing that they're out there can save a lot of time in overriding some of the processing rules that might come into play on those interfaces. There's also some things that you'll find buried in the system properties, I believe, and where are some of the other places that we might look if we were looking for some of the other settings that would impact our integrations that people might not know about quite as readily.
Well, you got the cron task application, which has the cron task instances like iFace table consumer or the XML file consumer. So if you're doing those types of interfaces, you would check those cron tasks. You would want to, you could configure it by the external system. You can configure it by the enterprise service, and then you can set those to kind of process those records on a time schedule of your doing, of your liking. So if it's daily, if it's every minute, if it's every 10 minutes, lots of options within that. You've also got the opportunity to set up web services, and you can set up web services for the different operations, REST endpoints in general. You got to know where you're putting this data to. API keys can be assigned to users so that they can pass those rather than their credentials for the REST integrations. The MIA global directory, there's a max var for that, so that all that XML for that is stored in that kind of location. And then with JSON mapping, that's kind of one of the newer ones. That's huge in the GIS world, but it's a wonderful tool. Kind of simplifies the JSON objects, and you take the JSON object and you compare it to a Maximo object structure, and you can add or remove attributes, objects, kind of the same way. You can set them to default values. You can just kind of map them to the value that is coming in your data. You can concatenate. There are some limited Java functions that you can do within the JSON mapping, but and the testing is pretty good within that application too. So you can kind of see what it looks like in JSON, and then kind of run the test, and it puts it right there in the XML. And that's kind of what Maximo will be processing.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about troubleshooting and error processing, because that's always, something that we need to do once the integrations are built. There's always a few things that seem to slip through or cause unexpected results. So with the message tracking and message reprocessing, we talked about message tracking a little bit earlier, and the ability to just, capture messages and parse out key data elements of those messages so it makes them easier to find and look at that. We haven't really talked about the message reprocessing applications. We can talk about that a little bit. And then what are some of the other things that that you find helpful as you're troubleshooting an interface?
Yeah, so there's a setting for file-based error processing, and what that'll do is it'll actually it'll take the record that it's trying to load and put it into XML, or not XML, Excel. And it basically kind of creates a data load import sheet, like you would do if you were doing a flat file import. And it'll tell you the error that's on the end. So if it's this domain value doesn't exist, then you have that data right there, and it's newer but not too new, and it's something that I've begun using that is very, very helpful. And it only includes the ones that error out, which is very helpful. But if you have a master data load sheet, then you'll have to go back and make the edits there too. But that's a really big game changer in the last several years here. You also have the opportunity in message reprocessing to make edits to the data to help with the processing of that. So again, if it's a bad domain ID, you can actually switch it to the domain ID that you like, and then there's a button that says process the record, and it'll tell you whether or not it's good yet. So that's very helpful if you're loading a few records, or if you only have a few error records. If you're doing a massive import or a massive integration failure or something like that, where you have thousands of records, this might not be the method for you. But you also have the option to delete them. It's very good to make note, especially in an interface situation, of which ones are failing and why, if you're going to do that, and then come up with a plan to make sure that those get created in the system if need be. And then
sometimes you have to go fix the related record in Maximo. I mean, it may be that the data in the interface is right, but the domain is actually missing out of the domain table, or a work order status isn't appropriate for the update that's trying to come in. So the fact that it's captured in the reprocessing app, and you can go fix whatever's wrong on the Maximo side and come back and reprocess one or more messages is good.
Right. And then you'll have kind of the message versus the internal records. So like I know with spatial, you see the message in JSON, and then the internal records in XML. So kind of that test that I was talking about a minute ago. And here you would update the message, and then the JSON mapping would apply, and then it would update the internal record and process or not process.
Which is also a good way to validate your processing rules in your automation scripts.
Right. Yeah. So common errors would be another thing. You just kind of got to be aware of these. So if you're doing a change and the record doesn't exist, well, you're going to get an error. So you get, I keep talking about domain fields. It's very, very common if that doesn't exist. Or, if you're trying to put an asset at a location that doesn't exist, that's pretty common. Or field length issues. So in database, in Maximo, it might be 10 characters long. So like an asset number, could be 10 characters long, but you're trying to put a different asset number that's 12 characters long from the other system, and that might not work. So it's important that your field lengths in both systems are the same. So you'll have to choose which system to update. Obviously, you're probably not going to create new asset records in the other system to accommodate Maximo field length. So obviously change Maximo's field length to an appropriate length. Required fields, so asset numbers and site IDs are kind of required for when you're importing an asset. So make sure you check all those are in your data load or your integration, and make sure that if you're using an interface table or a flat file import or something like that, make sure that it's spelled right. We run into this quite a bit sometimes where the alias is important. Like we talk about the alias. So if it has an alias on it, then the flat file import needs to have that alias on it, or the site ID needs to be on it too. When you're looking at the message in reprocessing, and it tells you that it doesn't have a value for that field, it'll add that field to message reprocess, like the XML. And if there's no value on that field, that's the one you need to update. So the XML can break it out by each object that's in the object structure. So asset, site ID, or asset, spec, asset meter, stuff like that. So if it's missing one, if you're missing one of those attributes, it'll kind of point you in the right direction. So always check your XML and make sure it looks like it wants, like it should load. Other than that, for troubleshooting, you'd want to do some, you'd want to double check your configuration, make sure everything's enabled, check that the queue's not backed up. You know, the sequential queue, again, one message will stop everything. Make sure the appropriate contacts are running and that the last timestamp is at a reasonable time. The task scheduler sometimes gets locked up. There's ways to maneuver with that. As a last resort, you can restart. If you have a MIF server, you can do that without a large user effect. And then there's also, you can turn on the integration logger or the SQL logger. So those are all good tools to make sure you get there.
All right. Well, we're getting short on time, so I'm going to move on to what we consider some of the best practices. And we've talked about some of these a little bit already, but you know, duplicating delivered integration objects. So you talked about having separate objects for each interface and not reusing them too much. Unfortunately, you can pretty easily duplicate them and give them a name that's unique to what they're being used for, and that keeps your out-of-the-box IBM ones whole in case you need to reference back to them. I know it's a pet peeve of mine to limit the object structures to only the needed fields, particularly on interfaces. I get with data loads because those might change over the course of an implementation. You might want to keep more stuff on there, but there's nothing more frustrating than looking at something in message reprocessing or trying to troubleshoot something in a log and you've got 200 rows of data fields when you really only needed 10. So it might take a little extra time in the setup, but it'll save you a ton of time on the back end. Functionally, one of our core rules of setting up integrations is to try to keep users in their home system, so people aren't having to log out and log into other systems just to look up one piece of data. If I'm a CIS representative and I just need to know a work order status, then I should be able to get that work order status in my CIS system. And if I'm an asset manager that works in Maximo, but I just need to know one reading out of SCADA or something, I should be able to do that from Maximo. Along those lines, though, don't replicate data unnecessarily. I've seen a lot of integrations over the years that just did a full sync of basically mirroring everything like for like, and we don't want to do that either. And I think with the federated resources, which you've worked with a lot recently, Tom, that's another way to be able to visualize data within Maximo from another system, but not necessarily store it in Maximo. And then utilizing defined users with appropriate security privileges is also really important. So what are some of your favorite things or best practices that you would recommend as we wind down?
I think someone, I completely forgot about this when preparing for this, but someone just put in the chat to watch those CSVs with your your leading zeros and you know, because so you want to edit in XLS and then save it as a CSV, and then do not open the CSV and save it within Excel, or it will change the data on you. It adds those commas back in to, you know, for your naming conventions in your headers. So yeah, that's that's a really great point. And it's something that I've run into more than once.
Lost a lot of leading zeros and ended up with a lot of exponential notations too. So
and it's the worst when it happens on items.
Yeah. So very good. Well, we're just about out of time. I'm scrolling through the questions. Just as a trivia question here, one of the ones is how to load a large volume data, 100,000 assets. So what would you say is probably the most you've loaded, and how do you manage ones that are really large files like that?
It depends on your input device. So I know, like with our spatial ones, we do so with our spatial ones, we kind of do a limit within the query URL. You know, we limit it to 300 or 400 because they want to, especially if it's running like nightly. So you know, some of them run like 70 different features over the course of 2 hours to update their features. So we want to keep them doing enough that Maximo can handle it, and then kind of make sure that it's not going to interfere with any other ones to where you know, you take up all the resources, because MIF will take down your system.
Can.
But you know, SQL can be done the same way. So if you're doing an interface table, you can set up queries to kind of throttle it. So, you know, use row count or something like that to say, only give me the first 500 every 10 minutes or so. And, you know, you can kind of control it that way. Flat files, break them out. You know, you can do, you know, 10,000, 20,000 records, stuff like that to kind of make sure that Maximo has enough that it can chew. And a lot of it depends on, you know, your system resources, whether or not you have a MIF server, you know, and it's stuff that you just have to continually kind of tweak, and make sure um, that I would definitely recommend, if you're querying another system, that you're throttling it in some sort of way. I think
Yeah,
like we had
absolutely.
a GIS integration where they did a table update, so it tried to refeed us 80,000 meters in one day, in one go.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
All
definitely,
right.
you know, you take those lessons and you adopt them.
All right. Well, we are out of time. So thanks for joining me today. Good conversation. Hopefully those of you on the line took something away from it. I know there's quite a few questions that we didn't have time to get to, so we'll capture those and reach back out to you folks with answers. And as Sam said, the recording will be available for anybody that wants to come back and watch it again. Other than that, Sam, did you have anything to follow up with?
Just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming here and spending some time with us. We very much appreciated having you. I will be emailing all of you after this just to follow up, answer any additional questions that we have, and of course, share that recording. But you can always reach out to us on LinkedIn. You can find our contact information smattered on our website. We're pretty easy people to get a hold of. So we look forward to talking to all of you more.
All right. Thanks,
Oh,
everyone. Bye-bye.
and one final
Yep.
shout out for anybody who's going to the upcoming spring mug. We are
We'll
going
be
to have
there.
a booth there. So feel free to come and say hello. We'd love to see you in person.
Absolutely. Great. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.